Isn't it funny when people try so hard to be different from the thing they hate just to become that very thing? TYT, a supposed antithesis to the mainstream media, has been caught spreading U.S. propaganda.
Hey, I don't like Maduro. I mean, hey, dude won an election. Okay, which, by the way, is not necessarily the case.
No, yeah, it was a rigged election, that's clear.
It was a rigged election, that's clear.
Something is wrong. Something fictional.
Ah, yes. The claim that Venezuela's election was rigged. This claim is nothing new. The US government has been spreading this claim about Venezuela for years now, through funded academic journals and scholars that seem impartial to the uninitiated. For example, take the academic journal of Democracy, which is an initiative of the International Forum for Democratic Studies, which is a center in the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy is a grant-making institution created by the U.S. Congress in the era of Reagan.
Last year in London, I spoke of the need and obligation to assist democratic development. And my hope then was that America would make clear to those who cherish democracy throughout the world that we mean what we say. Well, the hope is now a reality. The National Endowment for Democracy, a private, non-profit corporation funded by the Congress, will be the centerpiece of this effort.
It's largely funded through the U.S. Congress on an annual basis. In the fiscal year of 2017, the NED got an annual appropriation of $170 million. According to the initiative created by the International Forum for Democratic Studies, called the Center for International Media Assistance, the NED spent $21.5 million, or 15% of the total grants it awarded on media development projects. So in 2016, the NED awarded a total of approximately $143,333,333 in grants. The NED is a multifaceted institution with 4 core affiliated institutes, which are the Center for International Private Enterprise, the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, the International Republican Institute, and the Solidarity Center. It uses its grantee institutions, specifically the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, to fund opposition groups in Latin America. Those groups include the political party Justice First, which was a supporter of the failed 2002 coup of Chavez, in which businessman Pedro Carmona installed himself as president. Sounds familiar? After Pedro Carmona announced his presidency, he dissolved multiple institutions, such as the Supreme Court of Justice. Did the United States government rail against his overreach in power? No. They recognized his presidency and blamed Chavez for his downfall and claimed they didn't know anything about the threats. Although, according to declassified documents, the CIA knew of the planning, and according to The Observer, with information from officials at the OAS and diplomatic sources, the US government did not only knew about the coup, but sanctioned it. One of the coup plotters was Elliot Abrams, a convicted criminal who was described by Rand Paul in 2017 as...
Elliot Abrams was one of the key architects of the Iraq War.
To its partial credit, the Justice First Party did break away from the regime after Pedro Carmona assigned a leader that was no longer affiliated to the party as Minister of Finance. As stated by Stephen Lefebvre, the Journal of Democracy has, quote, long focused on providing analysis to justify U.S. government intervention abroad, unquote. In 2013, it published a paper by Kirk Wayland titled why Latin America is becoming less democratic. It claimed that the 2012 re-election of Chavez was a fraud which contradicted multiple election moderating groups such as the Carter Center. Actually, the opposition leader Enrique Capriles remarked that there was, quote, absolute peace, unquote, during voting, and that, quote, Sunday's election has been completely peaceful, and that voters are showing they can settle their differences at the ballot box, unquote. Fast forward to 2019 and the same talking point is being spread. It's as if we're stuck in some type of historical circle, but instead of Chavez, it's Maduro's re-election that is now being claimed as a fraud without any evidence. In the conversation, there was an article by David Smiled, professor at sociology at Tulane University. It stated that in 2017, party officials openly committed fraud in regional elections. He cites an article from Venezuela Analysis, but the problem is the article did not support his claim that party officials openly committed fraud. It stated that, quote, despite scoring important victories in several key states, the MUD responded to the CNE announcement by refusing to recognize the results, alleging fraud, end quote. The opposition for the MUD refusing to recognize the results does not mean that party officials openly committed fraud. The article did mention the CNE's decision to relocate 334 voting centers from predominantly opposition majority areas, but that doesn't support his claim either. According to the same article, those voting centers were targeted by anti-government violence, and the relocation of voting centers is nothing unusual in representative democracies. Many representative democracies relocate voting centers for reasons such as violence or natural disasters. In the United States, local governments relocate voting centers to disenfranchise minority voters. So Venezuela is way more justified when it comes to the relocation of voting centers relative to other representative democracies such as the United States. His article is filled with multiple lies. He also mentions that in July 2017, the Socialist Party called an unconstitutional vote to elect an alternative legislator, which he's obviously talking about the National Constituent Assembly. I'll speak more on that later. Another clear misstatement is that Socialist Party officials forced the vote 7 months early to prevent the opposition parties from reorganizing. Nobody was forced into anything. April was the agreed upon election date per the official agreement of democratic coexistence for Venezuela, which was the result of years of dialogue in the Dominican Republic. At the last minute, the opposition backed out of the agreement, reportedly due to a call from Colombia that instructed the opposition not to sign the agreement, which was most likely at the behest of Washington. This surprised mediators such as the former Prime Minister of Spain, who wrote an open letter criticizing the move. Afterwards, the National Electoral Council, or CNE, decided to use April as the date for the election, until an agreement was reached between the regime and some opposition parties such as Progressive Advance and the Social Christian Party, to set the election date for the 20th day of May. An international electoral accompaniment mission was sent to Venezuela by the Union of South American Nations to observe the 2018 presidential election. The mission included politicians, electoral experts, academics, journalists, and so on. There were also observations from the African Union and representatives from varying Caribbean nations. Here's one academic from the University of Middlesex talking about what he observed.
Of the matter is when we actually went to observe. Because if what is presented to you looks very beautiful, you want to make sure that it works actually in practice. I went to Puerto Ordaz and went to the state of Bolívar, and I had 4 polling centers that I had to observe. observed the installation of the polling centers and several of the booths. Then I also observed several others when the voting itself was taking place. I make sure that actually I talk to the voters before they went to vote, and I talk to them after they came out of voting. I talk to people in the queues. I talk to the witnesses of the various political parties that were there in several of the polling centers, and I talked to them about the electoral process and so on. I could see exactly how it worked, and what the National Electoral Council told us actually worked. But it was much more interesting because every single one of the persons that I talked to, I asked them one question after the conversation. I said, do you think that the electoral system of Venezuela is reliable in your point of view? I talked to voters, witnesses from the various political parties. I talked to absolutely everybody, and 100%, and this is no exaggeration, 100% of those who responded to my question said, yes, we think it is reliable. So that is the proof of the pudding. There is no question about it that not only the CNE told us the truth, not only we were able to verify it in the terrain itself, but more important, the voters themselves, no matter who you ask, they told you exactly this. So this is a very interesting.
Here's a U.S. mayor talking about what he observed.
I can't say what I have observed since I've been here is an electoral process that truly have the safeguards in place, more high-tech than I could have ever imagined. For instance, the biometric identification, the use of your fingerprints to reconcile your identification, your voter registration card before voting. The whole inclusive process of inviting not only the government, but the opposition parties to come together and agree upon some guarantees and the citizens prior to the election makes it an inclusive process. The technology, although high-tech, I observe a process that the CNE put in place that allowed the voters to move through the process rapidly. It was user-friendly for those who were illiterate, being that the pictures of the candidate, not only the names, were on the ballot. And the voters actually got a receipt of that after casting their vote. That receipt was used later on to reconcile the accuracy of the total number of people who voted. One of the things that surprised me, probably more so than anything, was the egregious reporting of the Western media about what was going on in Venezuela. Prior to my arrival, my family members and friends were actually worried about me coming to Venezuela. The way Venezuela had been depicted in the Western media was if it was on the brink of a civil war. I can report to you today what I've witnessed are friendly people here in Venezuela, loving people here in Venezuela, people who were excited about this election. Of course, you had those opposition factions who protested the election. However, with a 46.2% turnout, that's just as high as any voter participation in the United States. The system that I witnessed here in terms of voting, I can say that it is a trustworthy and reliable system. I can probably go as far as saying even more so trustworthy and reliable than the one that is used back home.
Exactly. This echoes the mission's statement that the 2018 presidential election in Venezuela was fair and free. But it still drew criticism because Venezuela didn't allow an organization that has long been under the direct influence of Washington to oversee the election. The Union of South American Nations, which was created in 2008 by 12 South American member states through a constitutive treaty, has a positive image in the region due to its mediation efforts during border crises. It's completely understandable why Venezuela rejected the OAS to oversee their election. The OAS, as an independent arbiter of elections, has come into question due to its potential intervention in the elections in Haiti. For example, in the 2000 Haitian election, the OAS labeled the election as a great success until a campaign led by Washington to overthrow Haiti's government came into play, and then the narrative of the organization started to change, and it actively participated in delegitimizing the 2000 Haitian election by portraying the election as illegitimate. In the 2000 Haitian election, there was an electoral dispute, and the OAS was called in to settle that dispute. During the mission, the OAS committed two huge mistakes. They failed to do statistical inference on the sample of tally sheets so that they could draw a conclusion about the whole. And they didn't take into account the tally sheets that you will see were from areas that heavily favored Celestin. The OAS also reversed the election without a recount, which was highly unusual. The lead statistician of the OAS mission and the president of the American Statistical Association acknowledged that despite his involvement in many elections, he had never seen a case where an election result was reversed without a recount. And when asked why the mission did not do any analysis on the missing votes, he said that they did and found that missing votes were in areas that were on average more pro-Celestin than the general electorate. However, the mission had decided not to include this information in its report. In a general report by the International Electoral Accompaniment Mission, it was stated that, quote, "In light of the foregoing remarks and observations, we, the international accompaniers, consider that the technical and professional trustworthiness and independence of the National Electoral Council of Venezuela are uncontestable," unquote. And regarding the so-called red points that the opposition has decried as areas that the ruling party has influence over, were stated to be located within no less than 200 meters from the polling stations they visited, as stipulated in the Agreement on Voting Assurances subscribed by both the government and the opposition. So where's Anna's evidence that the 2018 election was rigged? In the Young Turks video titled "The Crisis in Venezuela Explained," the Young Turks give their reasoning for why they think the election was rigged.
The election, the recent election that took place in mid-2018, was not a fair election. And I think that the facts on the ground prove that. So for instance, many opposition candidates had been barred from running while others had been jailed or had fled the country for fear of being imprisoned. And the opposition parties argued that the poll would be neither free nor fair. And so voters who are more in line with the opposition actually boycotted the election because they're like, what are we doing? I mean, the opposition has been suppressed. What is the point in even participating in this election? So of course, Maduro gets elected. And
Anna's conclusion rests on a shaky premise that the government's actions, as reported by the BBC, were unjust. If the actions of the government were just, then her premise or premises by themselves are inadequate in proving the conclusion that the 2018 presidential election was rigged. This is a classic case of begging the question, where the arguer has unstated premises and their truth values have not been established. therefore creating an illusion that the stated premise or premises by themselves support the conclusion when in reality it doesn't. For example, there is a law in Venezuela that states that a political party is liable to have its legal status revoked should it fail to participate in 2 consecutive electoral processes, and that it may be subject to a process of renovation by the CNE, which includes collecting a sample list of its members' signatures. If a party fails to meet the law's requirements, the party and thus their candidates can be barred from running in the election. Again, this is nothing new in representative democracies. In the USA, political parties need to meet certain requirements to obtain ballot access. In the US presidential elections, political parties generally need to meet a criteria that's often based on the threshold number of votes cast at a recent election for a particular office or offices. Many states have alternative ways, such as filing a pension, and even political parties that have obtained ballot access need to file with the Secretary of State within a specified time frame. Another example of what can be considered justified barring of candidates is in 2017 when Enrique Capriles was barred from public office for 15 years by the Comptroller General's office for illicit administrative acts such as signing international agreements with the British and Polish embassies without legal authorization, flouting mandated procedures in state contracts, and failing to present the 2013 state budget for approval by the regional legislator. Capriles ended up leaving the MUD in 2017 after accusing former MUD member and former president of the National Assembly, Henry Ramos Alop, for being a spokesperson for the Maduro government, calling Alop's expulsion of 4 governors that swore in before the National Constituent Assembly as fake. Alop left the MUD in July 2018, citing a breach of a July 2017 agreement to hold primaries to select a unified candidate for the 2018 presidential election. Which brings me to my challenge. At the end of the clip, Anna implies that the opposition supporters were the only ones that boycotted the election, and neglected to mention that the MUD, which is the Alliance of Opposition Parties, also boycotted the election, and boycotted the election as stated after the opposition refused to sign an agreement that took 2 years to create after a reported call from Colombia. The barring and imprisonment of some opposition leaders happened before the July 2017 agreement to hold primaries, so if the boycott was largely about barred and imprisoned opposition candidates, why did the July 2017 agreement to hold primaries even exist? Why did they wait to officially boycott the 2018 presidential election after they abandoned the agreement created in the Dominican Republic? The MUD did not boycott the election because of supposed suppression. They boycotted the election because they were told not to enter the election. After withdrawing from the agreement due to a reported call from Colombia, the MUD sent Maduro an agreement that was different from the one that was initially agreed upon by both parties and internationally mediated. The MUD's proposed agreement demanded that there be a newly created National Electoral Council and that charges against several opposition leaders be dropped. They also claimed that Maduro's government changed the original agreement, although it was in the custody of the President of the Dominican Republic, and it was mediated by international leaders. This just shows you how inconsistent the opposition are. It's not surprising puppets can be inconsistent in their movements. If the ruling party in Venezuela committed widespread suppression, then why was it willing to compete with a popular opposition candidate in Henry Falcon, who was backed by multiple opposition parties. You would logically expect that Falcon, being a popular candidate, would have been suppressed. Instead, it was Falcon's own coalition that wanted to suppress him, as evidenced by his expulsion from the MUD after he registered as a presidential candidate. Furthermore, according to sources with knowledge of the matter, Henry Falcon was threatened by U.S. officials with financial sanctions from the Trump administration if he entered the election. The threat of expulsion from the opposition coalition, or MUD, suppresses the candidates of the opposition parties from participating in the election. Thus, this information supports the case for internal suppression at the behest of Washington more than external suppression by the government of Venezuela. Furthermore, the parties that participated in the election, such as Progressive Advance and the Social Christian Party, had no problems participating in the election, as far as I know. The government and the opposition parties that left the MUD to participate in the election even agreed on a set of stipulations for the election. The BBC News article that TYT cited tries to paint a picture of Maduro rounding up opposition members for the sole purpose of them being opposition members. It's completely devoid of proper context. For example, Leopoldo Lopez, who the US government described as, quote, arrogant, vengeful, and thirsty for power, unquote, in leaked documents reported by WikiLeaks, led guarimbas, or violent demonstrations, in 2014 to remove the regime. And with 108 pieces of evidence against him and his co-defenders, it wasn't hard to convict Leopoldo. In the trial, during questioning, he tried to intimidate witnesses by creating hypothetical scenarios during questioning where he would become president and the witnesses would be subjected to countersuits and legal actions for having participated in a case against him. He also gave a chilling statement in front of civil servants. He said, quote, "When I'm president, then you'll see." The US government's description seems to suit him perfectly. Another example is Popular Will Party leader Freddy Guevara, who was arrested for multiple crimes such as using adolescents to commit crimes, which refers to the 4-month anti-government protest campaign in 2017, where Freddy was a principal leader. The Supreme Court of Venezuela, or the TSJ, ruled that since the crime is considered flagrante delicto, his prosecution needed to be carried out by ordinary courts per the Constitution. The TSJ ordered a travel ban, and his response was to flee the country to Chile, which is common among the political elites. Once they get into trouble, they seek asylum in some other countries such as Chile or the United States while taking an anti-Maduro position. For example, the Supreme Court magistrate Christian Zerpa fled to the USA after a sexual harassment investigation. Other arrests were a function of an anti-corruption drive that was started by an anti-corruption bust in the oil industry. Or how about the Andrade case, where the US authorities sentenced Alejandro Andrade to 10 years for money laundering after he confessed to taking more than $1 billion in bribes for allowing private businessmen to take advantage of Venezuela's multi-layered exchange controls. Thus, they were buying dollars at a preferential rate to later sell in the black market. Something tells me if the government in Venezuela would have made the arrests instead of the US government, it would have been used as an example of the government of Venezuela oppressing the poor elites. Does right-wing violence get a pass? Should the committee of victims of the guarimbas, who thought that Leopoldo Lopez's charge of inciting public violence was too lenient and he should instead take direct liability for the deaths or injuries of their family members, be ignored? It's laughable because TYT is always opposing left-wing political violence.
There were some. Again, there's Black Bloc and there's the guys who were ruining the peaceful protests. Most of the protesters were wonderfully peaceful.
We didn't all agree for you anarchists to come.
and do that in the middle of the streets of Seattle? You think all the families in Seattle agreed? Yeah, go ahead and trash our streets?
What's even more laughable is VOX pretending to be an authority on Venezuela.
Maduro's political ambition became evident in December 2015. 2 years after he became president, a coalition of opposition parties called the Democratic Unity Roundtable, or MUD, won a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly, putting Maduro's rule at risk. In response, Maduro quickly forced out several Supreme Court justices and filled the positions with cronies loyal to him.
Liar! Let's look at the facts, shall we?
In December 2015, Maduro did not force out the Supreme Court magistrates. Their 12-year term limits were up, so they were replaced. Venezuela isn't the USA where activist justices without term limits can potentially wreak havoc on a country without some type of recourse.
That's the truth.
In March 2016, the court ruled to strip the opposition-led National Assembly of its powers, a move that sparked massive protests across the country. The ruling was reversed a few days later, but the damage was done. Protests continued to grow and have left about 100 dead and thousands injured so far.
Liar! Let's look at the facts, shall we?
March 2016, the Supreme Court did not strip the National Assembly of its powers in March 2016, as far as I know. In March 2016, there were rival marches between the Chavistas and supporters of the opposition, where right-winger Maria Corina Machado called on the crowd to oust the regime through non-constitutional means. In January 2016, the Supreme Court ruled the National Assembly as void after the National Assembly refused to follow a Supreme Court order prohibiting 3 opposition representatives from taking up office pending an investigation of vote buying during their election. In March 2017, the Supreme Court, or TSJ, temporarily assumed the role of the National Assembly to approve a slew of joint venture agreements with Russian and Chinese energy firms, which was put on hold by the legislator. This is the instance where the TSJ quickly reversed its decision after it was met with widespread outrage from the opposition. But what the TSJ did was not unconstitutional. It's justified under Article 336, Paragraph 7 of the Constitution of Venezuela, which allows the TSJ to take corrective measures as a response to unconstitutionality by omission. And the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. Thus, it's a court of last resort. You have to follow its orders even if you don't like it, or even if it's a blatant violation of the Constitution. I'm not saying the TSJ violated the Constitution, but in representative democracies, it's nothing new for the Supreme Court to blatantly violate the Constitution. For example, the United States Supreme Court upheld the actions of an Alabama prison to refuse Dominique Ray's request to have an imam attend to him in the last moments of his life, which means the imam was granted less access than the Christian chaplain, which was regularly given access in the execution chamber. This is a grave violation of the Establishment Clause's core principle of denominational neutrality as stated in Kagan's dissenting opinion. The political standoff between the Supreme Court and the legislator is one of the reasons Maduro called on for a National Constituent Assembly.
That's the truth.
Maduro held a vote in July to elect a new governing body called the National Constituent Assembly, which would have the power to rewrite Venezuela's constitution.
Liar! Let's look at the facts, shall we?
It's clear that this VOX commentator is really dishonest. He's leaving out crucial information coupled with a stern voice to make it seem as if Maduro is some rogue official, forcing people out of state institutions and abolishing the ones he doesn't like. Funny that nobody mentions the time when some hardliners from the opposition parties tried to initiate a National Constituent Assembly not to address economic, political, and social issues, but for power. And he mentions the protests in 2017 which were violent and perpetrated by the right wing. Why didn't he mention the gatherings that were in support of Maduro, such as these? Maduro can call on the National Constituent Assembly per Article 348 of the Constitution, which states that the call for a Constituent Assembly is invested in four institutions: the President of the Republic, the National Assembly by a 2/3 vote of its members, from the municipal councils in open session and by a 2/3 vote of their members, and from 15% of the voters registered with the Civil and Electoral Registry. Maduro is not violating the Constitution of that republic as stated by the Supreme Court. The Constituent Assembly can rewrite the Constitution, and that's nothing unusual in representative democracies. The reason why the US Constitution of the 1800s looks different from the Constitution of today is because it has been rewritten multiple times. Venezuela's constitution has also been rewritten multiple times. Its basic constitution-making process and amendments or partial reforms and constitutional reforms are part of this process. It's not unique to Venezuela. The Constituent Assembly still can't modify the fundamental principles and structure of the text of the Constitution. And the newly revised Constitution still needs to pass popular referendum just like it did in 1999.
There's the truth.
And essentially replace the National Assembly.
Liar! Let's look at the facts, shall we?
The purpose of the National Constituent Assembly is to solve the economic and political and social problems of Venezuela, not to replace the National Assembly. In the topics Maduro proposed for the Constituent Assembly to consider, not one of them included replacing the National Assembly. The topics were the nation's right and need for peace, improvements to the country's economy, an extension of the justice system scope to end impunity for crimes, constitutional recognition of new forms of popular and participatory democracy in Venezuela, such as communal councils and communes, the defense of Venezuela's sovereignty and protection against foreign intervention, reinvigorating the plural, multicultural character of Venezuela, a guarantee for the future of Venezuela's youth through enshrining in the Constitution their rights and the need to preserve life on the planet. Furthermore, the Constituent Assembly is filled with elected members. And they also seem to want to paint a negative picture of the National Constituent Assembly. The National Constituent Assembly has done great things. For example, it approved a law that would safeguard the small socialist organizations that exist in the country, called workers' councils, that were created in 2005 through grassroots movements and have been persecuted by workplace management in both the private and public sectors. If the United States had the problems that plagued Venezuela, you can rest assured there would be a restriction of civil rights. Maduro chose the more democratic option to stop institutional showdowns and to solve economic, political, and social issues.
There's the truth.
And leave virtually no opposition to Maduro's rule.
Liar! Let's look at the facts, shall we?
The National Constituent Assembly can be used as an opposition to Maduro's rule since it's independent due to separation of powers. And the National Constituent supersedes the presidency. It's the highest ranking institution in the country. Furthermore, the National Constituent Assembly is filled with elected representatives that instead of representing a party, represent a sector of society, such as the farming sector, and it even includes the business sector. There's also the student sector for people with disabilities, workers, pensioners, and so on. If VOX really cared about separation of powers, then the National Constituent Assembly is way more superior than the presidential systems where there's a unified government, meaning the legislature is controlled by the same party that controls the executive branch. which does more to undermine the separation of powers. The party members are less likely to oppose one another than members in the opposition party. You can see that example in the Trump administration. For example, the Republicans overwhelmingly supported Kavanaugh, while Democrats strongly opposed him. The Republicans overwhelmingly supported and quickly passed the tax cuts, while 0 Democrats supported it. The Republicans were also more quiet on scandals surrounding Trump, while the Democrats were more vocal about it. The Republicans even neglected their supposed principles. For example, the Republicans changed their line about trying terrorist suspects in civilian courts after Trump came out in favor of civilian courts and against military commissions in Guantanamo. Senator Lindsey Graham stated that, quote, if Obama had done this, there would have been a lot more Republicans out there, unquote. The same senator that lied in favor of Kavanaugh by saying that, quote, everybody named in regard to being there said it didn't happen, unquote, when the two people involved both said they had no recollection of the gathering that Ford described, not that it never happened. One of the individuals even stated that she believed Ford.
But come on, isn't it a great system? You've got to admire it just a little bit. Self-declared anarchist, is that right?
Who controls Satellite 5?
There's the truth!
The Freedom Foundation has been monitoring Satellite 5's transmissions. We have absolute proof that the facts are being manipulated. You are lying to the people.
Create a climate of fear, and it's easy to keep the borders closed. It's just a matter of emphasis. The right word in the right broadcast repeated often enough can destabilize an economy, invent an enemy, change a vote.
So all the people on Earth are like slaves?
Well, now, there's an interesting point. Is a slave a slave? If he doesn't know, he's enslaved.
This whole system is corrupt. Who do you represent?
I'm merely a humble slave. I answer to the editor-in-chief.
Who is he? Where is he?
He's overseeing everything. Literally everything. If you don't mind, I'm going to have to refer this upwards.
What is that?
Your boss. This has always been your boss. Since the day you were born.